Welcome to the Voices of International Relations, the A.S.I.A podcast, where global conversations come alive right here at Ashoka University.
A.S.I.A, the Ashoka Society for International Affairs, invites you to join us as we explore the fascinating world of international relations through conversations that matter.
With A.S.I.A, we're on a mission to make international relations as accessible as possible. We are Ashoka's premier IR society, connected to an incredibly young IR department right here at Sonipat. We're a community of curious minds passionate about understanding the complex tapestry of global interactions from interdisciplinary lenses.
Our podcast is designed to bring you face to face with the brightest minds shaping international relations today. We strip away the complexity and jargon to deliver thought provoking, accessible conversations that challenge your worldview.
Today marks our second episode of the Asia podcast, Voices of International Relations. Following the success of our inaugural conversation with Professor Shiv Shankar Menon, we are delving into India's evolving role in addressing global challenges today. This exploration of the India of tomorrow connects perfectly with the theme of our upcoming annual IR conference on April 11th, 2025. Global risks and local impacts. Non-traditional security in the modern era, where we'll examine how countries like India are developing innovative responses to emerging security threats.
And for this special episode, we invited a distinguished voice in international foreign policy and strategic thinking.
It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dhruva Jaishankar, a prominent foreign policy expert and analyst who has made significant contributions to understanding India's place in the evolving global order. He currently serves as the director of the U.S. initiative at the Observer Research Foundation America, where he provides critical insights on Indo-Pacific security, U.S.-India relations, and Asian geopolitics.
Dhruva has written extensively on international affairs and has been affiliated with several prestigious think tanks and policy institutions. His latest book, Vishwa Shastra, offers a compelling vision of India's future role in shaping global governance and security frameworks.
So, whether you're a student of IR, interested in glowing, India's growing global footprint, or simply curious about how tomorrow's security challenges will reshape our world, this conversation promises to be both illuminating and thought provoking.
Dhruva, welcome to the Asia podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start with the conversation from your recent book, Vishwa Shastra, where you sort of given us a glimpse into how India might shape the global order in the future. And a big part of sort of tomorrow's concerns about India's future and to be honest, the world's future is about it deals with issues which we don't really consider to be traditional parts of security. I feel like they come under the ambit of non-traditional security in the sense like um, climate energy and cybersecurity and some other aspects of security that don't really deal with physical spaces and battles on the battlefield. Instead, these new areas, I feel are going to probably take us into the future. And I want to ask you, how well prepared is India's framework and India's institutions? This can be military, this can be civilian, and how do you think that their readiness is suited to handle the evolving risks that come with the future of security of India and the world?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of assumptions in your question, and I think it might be useful to just remind listeners. I mean, what is the starting point for a lot of these discussions on what you call non-traditional security? Although even I think that term is changing in some ways, and let me try and provide some context for that. So one is, I think, until recently, and one could say until World War II at least, if not after that, the issues of international relations were really dominated by matters of war and peace. And so, in some ways, it was very much, when you start thinking about international relations, and a big part of it is causes of war. It's a fundamental international relations theory is this question of when do states enter into conflict and why do they do that? And there'll obviously be theoretical debates about that. But questions of war and peace, very traditional terms involving militaries of national militaries of countries was really quite a major part of international relations until World War II. It wasn't the only part of international relations. Obviously, you had international trade, international commerce, sort of global political economy. You had the flow of people and cultural contacts and religious links and things like that, which I also write about a little bit. But again, this question of war and peace was really quite important. Now, two things happened. One was the advent of the nuclear, which really started to limit conflict between major powers, particularly the nuclear powers and their allies. So this was really after 1945. That was really one major change. And so conflict, it's not as if conflict went away. We had interstate conflict, particularly in the post-colonial world and among smaller powers, often being supported by superpowers or other major powers. And then the other thing that happened really in the post-Cold War period was this idea of putting up under sort of U.S. bipolarity, and you have this idea that you had a much more integrated global world where conflict became interstate conflict became less and less common. And so again, this is statistically shown that both the frequency of conflict and the intensity has, for the most part, declined with spurts. There was a spurt in the mid-90s because of wars in Africa, particularly in Congo. There's been a spurt after 2010, 2011 in the Middle East, Syria. But by and large, conflict has come down. And so this idea of shifted in international relations to what was considered non-traditional security. There was a bit of subterfuge here, which is at some point, because people had different agendas, the development agenda, the climate agenda, suddenly it became very fashionable to frame these in terms of security. So suddenly the word security became somewhat all-encompassing, almost to the point, and I worried about it, to the point of becoming almost meaningless. So we started talking about human security and climate security and energy security and health security, food security. Questions of hunger have always been an issue. In fact, hunger was a bigger issue in the past when famines were much more widespread and much more devastating. And yet suddenly now we started talking about food security in a securitized context. And so suddenly I think after the 1990s, everything became security almost to the point where the term almost became meaningless. Now, coming to the present and looking ahead, I think a few things. One is I think that there's a danger that the discourse, particularly the academic discourse and the focus, really shifted so far from traditional security that today we've almost lost the ability to think in strategic terms in a traditional security context. And this is a problem that particularly the U.S. allies, Germany, Australia, others are now really confronting, which is like, wait, we have to think about a world where we have to ultimately a national government's major responsibility is the well-being of its physical security, right? So suddenly there's been now there's a lot of talk about the return to geopolitics. And I think in India's case, we're slightly insulated from that because there's a feeling that geopolitics never went away. We've had conflicts with Pakistan that have continued. We've had tensions with China. We've had so in some ways the securitized context in India has continued, even as parts of the world, including the advanced industrial economies, have moved so far away from that traditional notion of security. Now, I think we're in this world today where those traditional security concerns perhaps matter more than they have at least in 2 or 3 decades. At the same time, those issues that you mentioned are still very relevant. So today, economic security is an issue. Again, you can debate how to define it, whether that's the best term. I think again, there appears the reality of we're in a world where the climate is changing rapidly due to what is proven to be human action, right? And so, how do you address that both through mitigation and through adaptation, right? And so, I think these issues remain relevant. All I would say is these have always been, in some ways, to varying degrees, part of international relations, although not always characterized as security. And secondly, that I think we need to be a bit more precise about how we view that, without losing sight of the fact that traditional security matters of war and peace remains a very important part of international relations.
Right, Professor, absolutely. I think as our focus, I mean, the prime focus will always remain how the global security, how traditional frameworks of how we define security continue to impact global governance at large. I think one newer aspect that has come up recently has been this in reliance on on digital payments that sort of have enabled this different arena of digital cybersecurity and cybersecurity from a financial sense. So, I wanted to ask you, with the rise of digital payments in India's growing fintech ecosystem, how has financial cybersecurity become crucial for India's economic security? And how can India ensure financial cybersecurity in an era of increasing cyber threats to banking and digital infrastructure, especially considering that cyber is not really does not have a physical aspect to it as such, which is why both space and cyber sort of differ in that sense in terms of the sort of threats they present to the global um, governance system, I guess.
It's a broader issue of as I mentioned now, in some ways, everything and nothing is security. But cyberspace is a really interesting field, and it's complicated for a number of, and actually gets into a question that Shirang asked me earlier, which I did not address properly, which is how well prepared India is to deal with some of these threats. Look, I think financial security is one aspect of cybersecurity, but the reality is so much of our well-being and daily life is tied to the digital realm today, right? So everything from identification, payments, as you said, our finance, but again, a lot of our travel, our transportation, our well-being, our jobs, so many things are tied to the digital realm. And there are new kinds of vulnerabilities that come from that, which are not always physical threats. And maybe that's why people don't take it as seriously, because we can't physically feel the threat. So in theory, our bank accounts can be wiped clean, because there are numbers in the bank rather than, right? So, which is very different from somebody physically coming and stealing your cash, right? So, even though in material terms it matters perhaps more than ever because we're more vulnerable, that the fact is we average users don't always feel a sense of insecurity arising from these vulnerabilities until they actually feel it themselves. I'll give you an example. Like we had a case of a ransomware attack on a pipeline in the US a few years ago, and it shut down one of the main arteries of oil petroleum flows in the US. And for a while, you had much of the most heavily populated parts of the US, which you didn't have access to. I couldn't fill my car. Even in Washington, I couldn't fill my car for 1 or 2 weeks, and couldn't use my car as a result of that. And this is, I think, a very physical manifestation of how a random ransomware attack by private actors who were really out for money. They were not. There appears to be no further security motive. It wasn't political or anything. But we're able to shut down something so dramatic that affected people's day-to-day lives in a very dramatic way. So until people start feeling that, it's very hard for them to take cybersecurity seriously, and that's sometimes why, because it's in this invisible realm, that we don't sometimes have enough of a discussion or debate to even the basic understanding of cybersecurity and why it's important. So obviously that needs to be done. Now another challenge, this is important challenge when I talk about non-financial security, is today it's no longer in the realm of governments. Governments can do something about it, but ultimately a lot of the infrastructure is owned and managed and run by private actors. And so it is really up to them to ensure security. So increasingly, I think we're talking about a world in which international relations and security is increasingly in the realm of the private sector, private sectors, which makes coordination much more difficult, makes policy much more difficult to implement. Again, governments can provide regulatory guidelines and things like that, but it's very hard for them beyond a point to force private actors to do something unless it's embedded in law in some meaningful way. So that's really why, in some ways, when you ask, is India prepared? Sometimes governments can be prepared up to a point. So, let's take the example of cybersecurity. The military can ensure that systems are sufficiently strengthened against attack, through resilience, through various measures, air gapping, all of that. So they can take certain cybersecurity measures for the military, or for the public sector, for the government. But they cannot, at one point, ensure that every private actor or every private financial institution has sufficient security measures in place. Again, certain things they can do through law, through regulation, through incentive structures, and governments are trying to do that. But beyond a point, it is really up to private actors to understand this threat, the physical and cyber threats that exist, and to take measures to account for that. So I think the big question mark for me is there is an Indian government aspect, a public aspect of how well is India prepared for these kinds of challenges, the Indian government. But I think the question that is often not asked is how much private actors, whether it's consumers through public awareness, or whether it is private sector actors like corporate entities and things like that. How well are they prepared for these potential security threats?
Right, right. Yeah, no, I also sort of like, to add on to that, I feel like you said, the government can, or the military could do well to sort of support and protect its own assets. But we can't really ensure that the private sector does so as well. And also, with, for example, cyber threats, it's not as if it's a sort of a stable threat. It's a threat that's always evolving. And I want to talk about the latest revolution, and that's the most trendy revolution that's come about in the term in maybe digital era, which has been with the whole sort of studio Ghibli trends going on here. I really wanted to ask you a question about AI. Right. And I want to ask you, how do you think the future of AI will play out in international relations? Because right now it's being used to sort of, generate deep fakes, create misinformation, and you have these all campaigns going around. Um, I feel like, I want to ask you this, that it's leading to a lack of trust in certain institutions. And I want to ask you, what policy measures could India especially take to sort of counter the rise of this warfare, that, no, not warfare, but like misinformation, that AI is creating, is generating, and it's sort of making it easier to spread, particularly given the influence of how popular social media is becoming.
Yeah, so I think a few questions embedded in what you asked. One is, I think, at a basic level, I think it's helpful to think of AI as it is a tool that can be used like any tool in a variety of ways, for a variety of purposes, for good or for not good purposes, right? But think of it as a tool, and like any tool, it is also limited in what it can do and what it can do effectively and efficiently as well. And an example I give is sort of we just because we all have calculators doesn't mean we don't need to understand math, right? We need to understand some of these principles, even if it is very easy to get answers to questions, right? We don't need to do, we need to understand the principles of long division, even if you can, can use computers or calculators to do a lot of complex math.
Yeah.
Of problems. So AI, like any tool, I think will be used in a variety of ways. Where only at the cusp of even understanding what it's capable of. But on the question of misinformation, I think so far, and again, things can change very rapidly. It's unclear that AI alone will contribute to misinformation in a way. Like the majority of misinformation today that exists is not because of AI. It can be done much more simply and effectively through, I can create a fake article and send it on and it can get traction and without using any AI tools at all. And so far, there's actually a study I think that Princeton University did where they looked at the last Indian election and the US election and role of AI in misinformation. They found a very small fraction of, like I think 2 or 3% of AI of misinformation cases were really AI generated. So it's not really having yet that much of an impact. And in many cases, by the way, a lot of the functions that people are using AI for, there are again more efficient ways of doing it, and I think people underestimate the enormous computing power that is required for some pretty basic AI functions, and then also the level of sophistication and effort that is required in training some of these models, these models for generative AI. So again, all I'm saying is I don't think on the one hand we shouldn't dismiss AI completely. It is changing the world and changing the world in big ways. I also think we should be about buying all of the idea both positive and negative that AI will suddenly unleash a lot of positive effects on the world. I think the reality will always be somewhere in the middle. And I think it'll just be interesting to observe and to be nimble about. One of the things is sort of oftentimes the instinct of Indian government in particular, but governments in general, is when there is a new development is to ban it. Because governments fear things, right? So the first reaction to crypto was to ban it, right? The first reaction to a lot of the early internet laws, particularly drafted in the wake of the 26/11 attacks in 2008. The terrorist attacks were very wide sweeping in ways that were very impractical to enforce, right? It became any computer-to-computer communication fell under the IT Act. It was very wide sweeping in a way that was really unenforceable. So governments tend to do things they don't understand. And sometimes what ends up happening is very laws that are so sweeping as to be impractical. Then you have countermeasures taken usually through courts, and you usually end up in the right place in the end, but often through a very lengthy process of trial and error, regulatory, over-regulation and under-regulation, and then you usually end up in the right place. But and I think part of what those of us in the policy sphere need to look at is how can we shorten that time frame? How can we make sure that instead sometimes there's a 10-year iterative process becomes a 2-year iterative process instead. But the reality of any new technology is you'll have this new innovation, which is good. It'll come mostly from the private sector. It'll get commercial viability and broad acceptance. Then governments will suddenly wake up and realize, wait, there is this area that we don't know anything about. Their innate reaction is to distrust and fear this new technology. So let us regulate, find out if it's practical, and then move back. So I think we're in this phase right now with AI, which is governments are still figuring out whether it is better to under-regulate it first, and that is the instinct of the US, for example, or whether to start by over-regulation, which is the EU and to some degree the Indian response. I think in India the question of enforcement is a bit more open, so the EU is going with just regulate first and then try and backwards from there. But I think in the end we'll land in the right place in the end, but after a lot of trial and error.
Yeah. I hope that we end up in the right. Because to be honest, I'm really liking a few of the things AI does.
No, again, it'll be very useful. It's fun as people can see. I think one other aspect I just want to highlight, because you mentioned the Studio Ghibli craze right now, is I think everyone should realize that if you use any kind of AI app, you use Grok, you use OpenAI, that everything you put in is going to be used as part of the model. So every time you put in something, facial information is being used as part of the model, even if it's anonymized. And I think that's just something a lot of casual users may not be entirely aware of, and maybe other people are aware of it and don't care, don't mind. But I certainly am very wary about posting a lot of personal content on AI and using AI, right? Because the other side, I think the basic understanding is that a lot of that will be found and will be used.
Right, Professor, absolutely. And I think if I just regroup here at this point and sort of take our audience take our audience from the first question to and how we're ending this segment of the podcast. We started off with discussing how traditional security complicates non-traditional security. Then we moved on to talking about the different aspects of non-traditional security beyond, um, climate and energy, perhaps, which of course energy will come to later on as well. And then we've talked about AI as well. And this particular tidbit I saw, I think, on an Instagram reel, which I was quite surprised about, is how every time we do an AI search, every time we put in a picture and ask AI to turn it into a giblified version of it, there are servers in countries that are actually overheating, and there is water being used to cool those servers, and there are wind farms being used to generate electricity that will have use fans to cool those servers down. So at every point, while we view cybersecurity, while we view the cyber infrastructure as something like that does not have a space, every time a subsea cable is harmed, and any search that we do, any Google search that we do, at all points of time, there are certain aspects of the environment that we are affecting. And even when it comes to traditional security, like through proper warfare and things like that, every time we do an A.S.I.A test, there is space debris being created. So what I've sort of gained from this particular segment is how traditional security challenges bleed into creating non-traditional security challenges for the world, which is why, considering the bit I told about AI, about how digital infrastructure is connected to environmental infrastructure, I wanted to talk about um, the challenges India is faced with its neighbors, especially in terms of water security. I think this is something you've covered in the book as well. Um, when it comes to resource security, I'm curious to understand how the geopolitics of water bleed into creating traditional security challenges, perhaps, for India. Water security creates tensions between neighbors. And so, let me take an example. I spent about 3 years in Assam, and I wanted to ask you about how the Brahmaputra River, which originates in Tibet, which is a lifeline for India's northeastern states, China's dam construction on the river has raised considerable concerns about water security, which which is an aspect of non-traditional security, but has created quite a bit of impact, or let's say, perhaps a very strong word to use, but has affected the tone of foreign policy views with the country, especially, right? So, when it comes to dealing with our neighbors, dealing with resource security, and also ensuring that it doesn't bleed into a standoff and things like that, how do you see the future unfold for India in terms of geopolitics of water? Or should India perhaps pursue stronger diplomatic measures to prevent unilateral control of transboundary natural resources?
No, so one is that I think resources have always been contested, and the nature of those resources, what is considered a valuable resource, has changed over time in large part due to security, due to technological developments, right? So, in the past, things like iron ore and steel production and coal were very much more important. It changed over time to oil, gas, things like that, and again, now there's some big focus on critical minerals because people are realizing that that's very important for emerging technologies, including digital technologies as well. So competition over resources is always going to be an issue, even if they change over time. Water has been traditionally very important, just because it's vital for human survival. It is vital for agriculture. And particularly for a country of India's size, it's and which is very sort of dependent on small scale agriculture for food security. Water plays a particularly important role, and also political role as well, right? So we've had contests between states, over the Kaveri River, for example, between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, sharing of water between the states, between Bangladesh and India, as well. So the question of water source, competition over water and agreements over water is important. And again, one of the earliest treaties that India went into was the Indus Waters Treaty, about sharing the rights to river in Punjab between India and Pakistan. So again, all I'm saying is there's a lot of new issues that have come up. I think it's been accelerated by a few things. One is groundwater depletion in parts of India, which is increasingly become an issue. And groundwater are actually a major source of agricultural irrigation. Another is climate change is leading both to accelerated melting of the Himalayas, the glaciers in the Himalayas, and also a more uncertain monsoon and unpredictable monsoon patterns as well. So that's contributing to a lot of the uncertainty around water. With China specifically, there is a question which is what is called the upper riparian country. In this case, it is China. In the Indus Waters Treaty, that's India. It traditionally has more power because they can dam water and prevent the flow to downstream. And I think the question was in the past, people did raise a fuss over some of the dam building in the Brahmaputra. Even at the time when there was some evidence that it was mostly what I call run-of-the-river dams. Now I think there's real concern that a lot of the dam building efforts that China is undertaking right now have the potential to heavily affect flows downstream, whether it is intentional on China's part or whether it is unintentional in some cases through silting and other processes that will result from dam building on China's side. So I think this is increasingly a concern. It's obviously particularly sensitive in Northeast India. Obviously, beyond certain diplomatic measures which India can take, whether it is through bilateral or multilateral agreements, and through monitoring activities, sharing of hydrological data between countries. Those are some of the measures. I think ultimately also a great deal of resiliency factored in. And what we're seeing already is India using against diplomatic efforts to increase investments in water security initiatives, particularly in Western India, Rajasthan and Gujarat, including with the help of countries that have some of the most advanced technology, which is Israel, but also working with the UAE and other countries which have similar concerns about water scarcity in desalination efforts and other efforts that are trying to retrieve water flows. So these, I think, are some of the efforts that are underway. Sorry, I had to do a bit of
Right, no, that's okay. So we can just continue straight. That's okay. That's no problem. Yeah, we can just leave where you left off. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was done with my
all right. Lovely. Okay. So we will cut from about here. Okay. Now here's a favorite topic of mine. Nandika knows this because I've been trying to get her to do a podcast on this topic for a long time. And you really mentioned it in your previous updates, something about energy. And I want to sort of ask you with a little bit of a futuristic perspective, but also it has something with contemporary India as well. So right now India, and it has been for since the independence, it's been particularly dependent on oil from abroad. Right now we're dependent on the Middle East and Russia, and right now the geopolitical not stability, but there's a lot of activity going on there. And because of that, I want to ask you what's India's long-term way to go about these policies, especially since I'm talking about renewable energy. Which should be important in the US. So there's a they're going to report nuclear, so on and so forth. And I want to ask you, do you think, how do you think, the future as it unfolds, how do you think that will not help, but how do you think that will affect India's geopolitics in terms of energy security? Would it reduce the amount of um, oil that we sort of buy and that we're dependent for, and obviously with the renewable shift? And I want to know what's your opinion on that.
Well, so my opinion doesn't matter very much, but I can sort of briefly, and many people are doing a lot of good work on this topic, including my current place of work and also my previous place of work, what's now called the Center for Social and Economic Progress in Delhi. And I would defer to I would suggest you read what we've been working on, because it's precisely this issue.
Yeah.
But India is at this point the third largest energy consumer in the world after China and the U.S. And it's only going to grow. I think even modestly, we're looking at a doubling of India's energy needs in the next decade or so, possibly tripling in the next decade. And that's just a natural outcome of industrialization and higher growth rates and greater consumption and all of that. The question is, how can you do that in a way that is way more efficient? And already again we're seeing some of the technology enabled where on the consumption side you can actually make changes that make whether companies or large institutions or households more energy efficient in various ways. But then there's also on the production side, on the supply side, how to diversify and strengthen India's energy security. Now, so far the approach has really been for India sort of all of the above approach, right? Which is increase coal, oil, gas, which are traditional sources. In fact, gas is seen as a somewhat cleaner alternative to coal and oil, and so using gas and LNG in particular as a sort of transition fuel to eventually a much more renewable, much heavier mix of renewables down the line. The bottleneck for renewables now is less on the generation side. That is, you're able to generate solar, particularly wind, in places as well. But there's going to be a bottleneck in terms of storage, because for solar, for example, you have plenty of solar energy theoretically available during the daytime, but not at nighttime when people need it. People turn on lights, people use air conditioning. So we need some way of storing all of that energy for 1.4 billion people. Similarly, for wind, there's seasonal differences. So you have during monsoon, you have some very high generation. But you have less so you can count those variations. So I think one of the hypotheses is the renewables is storage and storage, and that will happen which is why anything that storage you're finding storage as well. So these are some of the questions that it's also about distribution level and a lot of policy aspects. State level capital, how to actually make the distribution more efficient. It's a lot of generation, again, less generation level. So it's actually direction in which it's going. And the question is that how automated way that these structure of the economy and this requires again an absorption of technology and access to that technology, and it requires investments on a massive scale. We're talking tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. So where is that investment going to come from? So I think these are the questions, these are the policy questions really that are underway. And a lot of what I said is indicated by India's own commitments in the UN FCCC climate negotiations. where again India from the Prime Minister down have talked about what this longer term objective is for India. But I think that that's where we're at right now. But again, at each stage, you're finding that there are other constraints. So again, the question of critical minerals is there, the question of solar supply chains. Again, right now, India is still very dependent on imports from China for certain components for solar supply chain. There are again questions about the financial viability of wind energy, again at the industrial scale. Nuclear has been limited by questions of this nuclear liability laws, which again I think is an debate this year to amend that. So again, this is the broad direction that India is going. I think the real policy debates are about how best to get there and how to overcome some of these new hurdles on questions like storage, on supply chains, um, on technology transfers, and on investments that have constraining or hindering this transition.
Right. Yeah.
Right, Professor. I think, which with this, I think we have about two more questions we'd like to ask you. And before we run out of time and all those time considerations pop up, I just wanted to talk about the space aspect of security. And this is something we asked Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon as well. And we talked about how does diplomacy in space really play out. And
You mean outer space?
yes, outer
Yeah.
space. Right. So, how does diplomacy in outer space really play out? And his answer is quite interesting. He talked about how uh, the concept of warfare out in space is not something that can quite literally said possibly happen. And so when we talk about diplomacy in space, there might be a different way to deal about it on land, but perhaps the considerations are a bit different. So we have a panel coming up in our conference on diplomacy in space where we'll talk about A.S.I.A testing. We'll talk about how private actors and non-state actors have evolved their role in space. So I wanted to understand your opinion on the growing trend of, or not the trend, but how militarization in space remains a growing concern, and how India can balance peaceful space exploration through collaborative means such as Gaganyaan and Chandrayaan, and how can we also develop those counter space capabilities to safeguard our assets? How do you think India should
Yeah.
play this
So,
rather tricky arena?
yeah, so I think a few realities need to be kept into account. So one is traditionally was considered a global commons, right? So no country had sovereign territory in space, right? And that was how the world treated it. You actually had in the 1960s some outer space treaties that limited, for example, ban nuclear weapons in space and things like that, right? So you had some early efforts at arms control in space, even as early as the 1960s and 1970s. Um, the other thing about space is relatively few countries have launch capability in space, right? Because just the limits of geography and things like that. So we're really talking about 10 countries or so have a major launch capability in space. There are others that have space programs but are dependent upon these countries, these 10 or so countries for launch, for ability to launch into space. So that's another constraint. And the other thing, a factor that is sort of two things to keep into account in terms of which are relevant here. One is that India's space program is very unusual in that it actually began as a civilian enterprise. So most other countries, the space program started as a military program, and it assumed a sort of civilian and scientific component at the beginning, whereas India has actually started off as a non-military program, which is again very unusual, and has subsequently become military applications are now being employed. And then another factor to take into account, and this is a very important one, is that the launches have become so cheap and so available, so readily available, that the amount of objects in space have really doubled in the last 6 years. So essentially the world has launched more into space in the last 5 or 6 years as it has in the preceding, forever. So space is becoming increasingly crowded. Now, again, what is it? I think one is, the very idea that space will remain a commons is today being contested. There's actually limited real estate in space, but every level of orbit, there are actually only a few places where you can retain an orbit without risking collisions and the sort of other negative aspects of that. So essentially, the very idea that space remain a common is itself, I think, going to be tested, it appears, over the next few years. The second is, I think, there is already an arms race in space. You may not like it, but that is the reality, because various countries are now experimenting with a number of different new technologies in space. We're now talking about space-based delivery mechanisms that China has been testing. We're talking about an even possibility of nuclear weapons in space, again, going back on some of the earlier commitments that were made. Anti-satellite weapons, as you mentioned. So all of this is becoming more heated and contested. So where do we go from here? The reality is, I think, right now, there has been an effort in diplomacy in space. In fact, the European Union tried to advance a code of conduct on space a few years ago, but it didn't have much pickup outside of the European Union. But I think that this area, again, because there are really about 8 to 10 main actors that are required, that it is a smaller group of countries that will have to take the lead in negotiating any kind of, even if in theory people want a code of conduct in space. But then I think that there will also be the question about sort of distribution of essentially space resources, including the real estate at various levels of orbit. So this is all of this is to say that in some ways a very exciting time, because the technology in space is really developing quite quickly. Sort of there is a manned sort of human space flight aspect to it, which will be in some ways get more public attention. But there is a lot happening in terms of scientific research, in terms of communications, in terms of geospatial technologies, and use of that, and then of course the question of space-based weaponry. So in some ways it is a very exciting time from a technological perspective, and will be over the next few years. Space policy is really going to proliferate as an important area and domain over the next few years. But in some ways it is much more contested, and I think a lot of the assumptions that people had, for all the reasons I mentioned, that space will remain a commons, that space will remain largely limited to peaceful exploration, is something that is going to be increasingly. The idea that a very small number of countries will have a lot of space launch capability, even that will be contested, I think. For the years we're seeing, just to give one example, the UAE is making massive investments in space technologies, for example. So I think we're in a very uncharted terrain when it comes to space.
Right? Yeah. A nice experience for me, and I'm sure for the listeners as well. I hope it's been a good listen. We talked about so many things, on traditional security, and how the word security itself has changed so much. Going by things like cyber security and financial protection, and then we go on to my favorite topic, which is AI, and we talked about that, and then how doesn't mean we stop doing so much of that. And then we talk about water security, and then talk about energy security as well, and how the world is shifting the consensus, and we had a very nice chat about security. And this has been really informative and very you all watching. So I have one question for you, and I think this is the question I think a lot of listeners listeners to be able to ask is to me that was always support here and I'm just 19 and I want to ask you based on you've had such a wonderful career in international relations and you've done some real good work at the Observer Research Foundation in America. I wanted to ask you what's your most important piece of advice for a young scholar in international relations, for people like us, any advice on, how we can do better and get better?
I don't have any one. Look, I think everyone is going to have their own pathways, and everyone should play to their strengths. Certain people have certain strengths that people who have strengths that I don't have, and should make use of that. The other thing is that opportunities are changing all the time, and there are types of career opportunities that I've enjoyed, that I've had, which people in my parents' generation did not have, and my grandparents' generation would not even have imagined that. So all I'm saying is that we're in a world that is changing sufficiently that you need everyone will need to navigate it on their own, and there will be again challenges and opportunities that your generation will face. That again, for better or for worse, that I have not, and that's why I don't think I'm in the best place to offer specific advice. That said, I think a few things to keep in mind. One is, I think, for students of international relations, I do think some hard decisions need to be made at some point about whether you choose to pursue a career mostly in the public sector, and in India this means terms of joining the government or working in government or in an international institution, or in the private sector, or in the non-profit sector, or in the academic world. And in if you want an academic career, there is a particular path, which is you apply for a PhD program, get a doctorate, become an assistant professor somewhere, do a postdoc, assistant professor, and so forth. So I think that those are some of the, I think one of the positives is these are not mutually exclusive. People do switch between these tracks, but I do think having a clear idea, do you want to prioritize public sector, private sector, non-profit, or academic, is useful to think about, because again, each one requires a slightly different skill set, and each one has its advantages and disadvantages as well. I think a private sector is more lucrative. Public sector gives you more job security, gives you closer to policy making itself. What I like about the non-profit sector that I've worked in mostly is the flexibility that it affords, that it allows me to work on what I think is important, up to a point, in a way that other career tracks do not. I think the second thing is, I think there's some fundamental skills that I think anybody in any of these areas needs to have. And that is, I think, an ability to first have, people get very bogged down in theory for theory's sake, but I think theory is important because it helps your framework for understanding it. It makes sure you're asking the right questions. And I think that is very important. Second, having the ability to answer those questions, which requires some fundamental research skills. So I think, again, when people talk about theory and methods and things like that, and why you need to know your history and why you need to know quantitative methods and all of that, it's not for its own sake. I think people lose sight. It's really about, are you asking the right questions and do you have the ability to answer those questions? And what I find we have a shortage of is really those two things. A lot of people are tilting at windmills, so to speak. They're going after non-important or trivial matters rather than what is important. And two, even if they are identifying what's important, they don't have the language skills, the quantitative skills, the primary research skills to actually answer that. So I think if you can equip yourself with not all of that, but some of those skills, that is really fundamental, whatever the line of work you go into, and the level of application and so I think that those are just some things that I find that are important to keep in mind. I would say the last thing, and this is something I struggle with a little bit because the world is changing so fast, is there's another aspect of it, which is communication. Which is ultimately, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you're not able to communicate it effectively, it's lost. And traditionally, this was in terms of written skills. So writing was important. But we're entering in a world, a multimedia world, where today, to be honest, one YouTube video gets seen 2 million times in a way that a blog post that you spend or a report that you spend 6 months working on is read by, if you're lucky, 200 people, if you're lucky. So I think we're just in a very different world when it comes to communications. It's a world of sound bites. It's a world of tweets, and, X posts and stuff like that. And so an ability to master those communication skills is also important. Realizing that I'm frankly not very good with some of these new. I don't make TikTok videos and things like that. I'm not very good with that. There is a world in which these sort of new communication skills will also be required. So I'd say those are just some of the initial ideas I have. But beyond a point, we're in a field that is changing so rapidly that there will be opportunities and challenges that I cannot foresee 5 or 10 years from now.
This is a follow up to one aspect of your answer, and I remember discussing this in Ashoka with you after your talk about Vishwa Shastra. And something we were talking about was that how in the US the way policy is structured is that think tanks become a route to perhaps get into governance and then impact public policy or foreign policy in that sense. And that way, I think having talked to uh, Jeffrey Liebman also after a particular session, even he mentioned the same thing that PhDs, people who pursue PhDs, academicians in universities, their work gets picked up by the US government to sort of build policy and sort of experiment with what works and what doesn't. And my question, therefore, just a very perhaps a small question, just want to discuss how that sort of landscape can be established in India as well. Because I think, as far as my research goes, is that one way to enter policy making through the government side would be through UPSC or the state service exam and things like that. But if you're getting into think tank, there's a chance that your work might get picked up. But those two spheres can tend to be a little exclusive of each other at times. So, how do you think the employment aspect of young students in the humanities, whether it's pol science students, economics, and IR, how would all of these students, how should the job market in India change to integrate these young scholars better into the into the governance and so they can also make an impact, something
Yeah,
like that.
I understand where you're coming from on that, but look, the fact is, nobody's going to create jobs just to accommodate people. Just because you have a lot of IR graduates, no one's saying, "Oh, we need to set up a think tank to accommodate all the IR students in India." That's not how it works. There is going to be a demand side, and the fact is, in India, we have a policy making system for there are reasons for it that are historical and come from somewhere, which is really we have a political leadership, which is elected, and then we have a career bureaucracy that implements the vision of the political leadership, right? And then you have some checks and balances. You have parliament, you have the opposition, you have media, you have that. So that is really the fundamental basis of our policy making ecosystem. And as you rightly pointed out, the two ways of entering into that are either political. So in some ways, maybe what we need more of is our political leaders to take on more expertise and stuff. Again, some of that is happening. One example is something called LAMP Fellowship, which young people can go apply for and work in Parliament, and they get some experience working, in some cases very closely with a member of Parliament. But then the other way is through the UPSC exam, which is by and large for all its faults meritocratic, and it's a way of it gets people from all over India into central civil service. So I think that is really the fundamental of it. Now we have small-ish, I mean, again, larger than many places, larger than maybe outside the US, perhaps one of the largest sort of think tank ecosystems, but still relatively small. Which is you have 5, 6, 7 major foreign policy focusing tanks. You have more on working on other issues. Good work being done on climate and energy issues, on economic issues, and things like that. They have think tanks dedicated to that. NCAR, Korea, and others on economic issues, CEW, and others on energy and environmental issues. But foreign policy think tanks, you have a few, you have ORF, CSTR, IDSA, ICWA, a few places, RIS, which is another government think tank. Sometimes and others. So this is like the think tank ecosystem, but it's still relatively small. And so I don't, again, it may grow, but again, these are either dependent on government funding, or they're dependent on private funding. They have to come from one source. And so I expect it to grow because again, as India's interest and grow, but it will be marginal growth, it will not be an exponential growth. So this idea that we'll have like a massive tech infrastructure in the years ahead, even the US is still much more limited than people imagine. So I think that's where the field is going. I think the way is to excel by having what, as I mentioned at the outset, is having the basic skills that are really. I don't know anyone who has done very well on government relations in India. So I have a certain level of Russian language proficiency. And there's not good language. Russian. So it's one of the things that's important. And sort of academically policy since the 1980s. Again, it's a subject. There's nothing recently on East Asian relations that I can think of. There's certain chapters of Indian diplomatic history that are not covered in the 1990s. Nothing significant has been written on that. 1965 war, nothing significant by an Indian written on that. So there is very, and not to mention all of these new areas that you and I have discussed over the past hour, which is, AI, energy security, space. Again, there's some very interesting work being done in all of these areas, but there's still so much more to be done. And so I think there are plenty of opportunities, but I think it requires, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of having the wherewithal to be able to pursue those well. And I'd say that for emerging scholars, emerging practitioners, if you're able to really master one or more of these areas, that will make you indispensable.
I think that was quite a pragmatic answer. We got a realistic understanding of how things are going to progress, but also a really optimistic understanding of what all work there's still left for us to do. So thank you so much for that answer. And before we conclude, I think Srirang and I just wanted to talk about, tell our listeners about the upcoming annual IR conference, which is on April 11th at Ashoka University.
Yeah, exactly. And as we discussed today, India's future global strategy, its Vishwa Shastra, if I may say so, will need to address increasingly complex, non-traditional security problems, and this is exactly what our conference wants to explore.
Our theme, Global Risks and Local Impacts, Non-Traditional Security in the Modern Era, examines how emerging powers like India can develop frameworks to address transnational threats while considering local contexts and solutions.
Exactly, Nandika. And this conference will have dedicated sessions on several issues that we've talked about today, including digital sovereignty and cybersecurity governance, research security in a changing climate, and space security. This is especially about India's expanding capabilities and about the topics that we've discussed here, but we're going to discuss about so much more detail, and it's going to be so much more fun.
I,
And
I think
yeah.
I think we'll be going the Vishwa Shastra way, and the conference will discuss how India specifically can shape global governance structures while developing domestic resilience against these evolving challenges.
Yeah, and the conference is going to bring together policy experts, academics, and practitioners to sort of reimagine security models for tomorrow's world. and so whatever idea you thought you had about security, just be prepared to be blown away.
So whether you're interested in India's future global role, technological disruptions in security, or the shifting balance of power in international institutions, this conference offers a platform to engage with all these critical questions, especially from the lens of India, which is exactly what we believe the Vishwa Shastra from India's way should be. So, before we end, I just wanted to hear from you, Dhruva. Talk to us about how Vishwa Shastra will continue. Like how Vishwa Shastra is your. What does Vishwa Shastra mean to you, the book? And tell us a bit more about how the book sort of tells us about India's history through foreign policy and what you think India's future role in world politics will be.
No, so I mean, in writing the book, I basically I have a copy here. I wrote the book off and on over 8 years. It came out last year, last December, about 4 months, 3 months ago. And the idea behind it was I wanted a book for students like you, for young people, for average readers, to just as a sort of entry point to understand India's international relations. And then, because I felt there was not a book out there that I could recommend to people saying this is what you need to know as a basic, just to have a basic understanding. So what I did was two things. I said, first, let me just chart out a history. So in about 200 pages, it has a history of India's international interactions in 5 phases: one before independence, and then four after, and periods of time after independence since 1947. And what I tried to do is for each period define what are the key uh, factors in India's engagement. So that in each chapter about 5 or 6 key themes, and then describing essentially what happened. And I tried to make it as objective as possible. I outlined what the big debates were on different issues, where India landed in some cases. But I've tried to make it less judgmental, and so that readers will just understand. And I've documented where to read more about all of these subjects. So in some cases, a major event is described in 1 or 2 sentences, and then if you want to read more, you can find out. So one is providing a basic understanding of the history. And I'm surprised that even now I got a question a few days ago about, is this the first time India is dealing with such a messy geopolitical environment? And actually, read the book, you'll find that India has had to deal with much messier geopolitical situations over the past 70 years, if not longer. So I think another question I get a lot is like on India's neighborhood. Just remember what is happening now in the last 2 or 3 years, and I have to remind them what's happened 5 6 years ago, which were quite difficult in some cases or painful, let alone what happened 20, 30 years ago. So I think having that historical grounding is necessary. That's one. Two, the second part of the book really describes it's more my opinion of what I see as the outline of India's strategy. And it starts from, and then the broader region, the Indo-Pacific, is the third. A little bit on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and West Asia, the Middle East, is a fourth chapter. And the fifth is on the international order, global governance, and multilateral institutions. So that, in some ways, it's sort of starting at home and building out from there. What should India's strategy be in this evolving world? And then finally, it was about 450 books at the end for further reading on sorted by topic. So if you want to know more about India-China relations, you want to know more about India and international institutions, India and technology, the different sections of that. So again, I've tried to keep it quite basic. It covers a lot of background, but very superficially sometimes. So I hope it's a useful introduction for students, but it also gives a way for people to just learn more about sort of how India looks at the world.
Right. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights today. It's been lovely. I'm Srirang. Thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to continuing these important conversations in our upcoming episodes.
In fact, I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Because the video sort of paused on my screen, but yes, Thank you so much for your time today, Dhruva. We wanted to ask you so many more questions on multilateral organizations and how India can deal with all of those things. But honestly, it's really sad that we're short on time this time. But I hope the next time you come to Ashoka, we can talk more about these things.